Hey everyone, welcome back to Presscast. I'm Farbs, and in this episode I'm joined by Eric Margolis, award-winning American columnist, and we will be talking about his ties to the Muslim world, about Afghanistan, and a lot of other topics. But before we get on with it, don't forget to press the subscribe button and the like button. And one more thing, during the recording, because of some technical issues, the lighting was pretty off. So please bear with us, and hopefully you will not see a lot of me and more of Eric. So let's begin. So, Mr. Margolis, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
So to better framing the conversation, could you give us a little bit of a history about yourself? I mean, in your own words.
Well, I'm a native New Yorker. My father was a New Yorker. My mother came from Albania, and that gave me special insight into the Muslim world. I went to school in New York. I was at Georgetown University Foreign Service School. I went to New York University Business School. I enlisted voluntarily in the U.S. Army for 2 years during the Vietnam War. I thought it was every citizen's duty to serve. Now I regret my decision, but I did it anyway. And since then, I've worked as a businessman. I run lines of ships in the West Indies. I have worked for Estee Lauder, and then I had my own company for the last 30 years in New York and in Toronto, Canada. And I'm now retired from that business, but I'm busy doing work in philanthropy in helping abused animals.
Wonderful, but you never mentioned that you were a journalist?
Yes. So I 40 years.
A little bit of information.
I still work as a journalist, columnist, and TV broadcaster. I've done all the major American networks until kicked off for saying naughty things. And
I would love to know more about that. Would you elaborate on that story, if you may?
Well, I have been tried to bring forth the position and the thinking of peoples who have been made unpopular by the media in North America, that is Iran and Palestinians, particularly. And I have focused very often on Muslim affairs, which are of great interest to me. And so I've taken unpopular positions and paid the price, I might add.
So would you please also talk to us a little bit about your connection to the Muslim world as outside your maternal links to the Muslim world? But I mean, have you ever traveled to the Muslim world? Where have you been?
All over the Muslim world.
I want to know more about that.
Many times.
When did you start it? When was the first time, and where did you go?
I started when I was 14 years old, and I went to live in Egypt. And
wow.
I spent time there. Afterwards, I traveled extensively. I was going to join the Algerian Revolution against the French. My mother, who was very clever, stopped me. She got the Algerians to turn down my application to go, which was a good idea because I would have probably been killed. After that, I traveled both as a tourist and as a businessman. I did business extensively across the entire Muslim world, primarily when I was working for Estee Lauder, which was a very interesting business. And then for my own interest as a journalist, of course, I traveled all over. I've covered wars in the region and in Africa. I have covered the Pakistani-Indian conflict over Kashmir in the high Himalaya mountains. I covered the Iraq wars, the struggle between the Palestinians and the Israelis, the Lebanon war. It looks like we're going to have another one very soon. So I've been everywhere in the Mideast, and I really know the area pretty well.
But you have been to Iran as well, have you?
I have been to Iran. It's been a long time since I've been to Iran. But
when was the last time?
The last time was before the revolution, and
wow,
when it was still under the Shah dictatorship. And so I regret not having been more often to Iran.
You should actually come and visit.
I know I should. I've just been on the internet with some old Iranian school friends of mine who are in Tehran, who I would love to see at some point.
I'm really looking forward to actually meeting you in person one day, hopefully, or at least, I mean, come here for the food. I mean,
yes.
So, let's talk a little bit about the Muslim world, and specifically the region where Iran is and one of the neighbors, Afghanistan. Have you been following the developments
in Afghanistan? Yes,
yeah,
very avidly, fascinating.
So what's happening, in your words?
In Afghanistan?
Yeah, I mean, like in a span of a couple of months, the Americans left. That government is no longer there. There's Taliban there, and then there's Daesh. So what's happening?
Well, it's very complicated, but Afghanistan is always complicated. I have been writing since early 1990s that the Taliban would eventually win, and that it was the true, most representative political party in Afghanistan. That the West had no business in Afghanistan and should get out as fast as possible. Well, I've fired from newspapers, radio stations, and TV programs for saying that, and for trying to present the view, a little more of the view of the Afghan people, not just the tiny Western, pro-Western elite that was pampered by the Western occupying powers. I don't like colonialism. I've covered many colonial wars in my time, and I really hate them all. I believe in independence, and I've seen the fight of the Muslim people in many countries. In fact, I've written 2 books on the subject. I forgot to mention that: War at the Top of the World and American Raj, and how America rules the Middle East. And my views, of course, have gotten me in trouble constantly.
Is this notion true that some are speculating that the United States is losing interest in the Middle East, mainly because of oil being not the first, that high commodity, and then that the United States is also producing enough oil for itself? So maybe one of the reasons that the United States left Afghanistan was because they had more important issues to deal with. China, for instance. Do you think this argument holds?
In part. Trump, even though I think poorly of him, I must say he was the first president who actually said, let's get out of Afghanistan. And excuse me. So you can't escape the cell phone anywhere. But I think in part America is, this pivot to Asia. Now, of course, all the interest is in Asia. But there is a collective loss of interest in the oil in the central Caspian basin, for sure. And the Americans just found this nasty, difficult war too much to take after a while. There was no uproar in the American public about this war that dragged on for 20 years or so. But eventually, the ruling elite in the United States came to see that there was no military victory and that the war was just getting too expensive. $3 trillion. I couldn't even write that out on a piece of paper. How much is America? And at a time when America is falling apart and needs to spend additional money on military operations in Asia. So those are the reasons. And the fact that they couldn't defeat the Taliban. This is the first, after Iran, this is the first country that stood up to the West and actually defeated Western efforts. It's quite remarkable. It was a historic victory.
Interesting. So how do you see the future? Do you think that the Taliban could actually form government, and then, or do you think other scenarios also could play out?
Well, as you get older, you get cynical, and I have, after my experience with the Algerian Revolution against it was a heroic, noble war of independence. And then the FLN, the Algerian rebels, turned against each other, began killing off each other, and it was very, very depressing. And Algeria ended up as a ugly dictatorship. And the same thing threatens in Afghanistan, because the Afghans, as we all know, are not a very cooperative people. They are a tribal people. They have lots of vendettas and arguments with one another. And I fear that they're going to be fighting with each other soon, once the euphoria of driving out the Americans evaporates.
So, I mean, there was this conference. The name was, I think, the Neighbors of Afghanistan, the Friends of Afghanistan. And then the outcome was that the best solution for Afghanistan moving forward was a coalition government. And then what you're saying is totally in contrast with that notion, because, coming from a tribal background, it's really hard. This same experience really failed in Lebanon, in Iraq. Correct me if I'm wrong, but do you think
I was there and I saw it. Yes, it failed.
Yeah. So, what is the solution? I mean, humanitarian look to the future of Afghanistan. So, what could they do to make a future for the families? I mean, what is the solution for the better Afghanistan?
I'm not sure. The Afghans have to grow up and learn to cooperate with one another. But the problem is you've got three or four major ethnic groups who really dislike each other. They've been fighting with one another. Foreign powers have been stirring the pot in Afghanistan. Foreign involvement is not over, even though the Americans pulled out their troops. They're now funneling money to the Tajiks and arms. The Soviets, the Indians are involved big time. That's a major problem. They're trying to stir up problems and take over Afghanistan, to drive the Pakistanis out. So Afghanistan will remain a battleground for the foreseeable future. And it's so poor that, when I was there once, I remember seeing, when I was with the Mujahideen who were fighting against the Soviets, these men, Afghan warriors, go in the middle of the winter climbing mountains in their bare feet. They were so poor they didn't have shoes. And they'd climb all night up through the snow to fire mortars at Soviet positions. And I looked at this and I said, they will never be defeated. So you have these wonderful, courageous people on one hand, but the curse of the Muslim world, tribalism on the other. And I'm happy to say Iran has done a fine job of producing a consistent position, keeping some form of national unity. These other countries have not.
So when you said Afghans need to grow up, what do you mean by that? I mean,
Well, it's hard language for them who've been bombed and blasted for 20 years to tell them that from the safety of my own home. But I have risked my life in Afghanistan many times, so I feel that I can criticize somewhat openly. They have to learn to compromise, and they have to learn to get along with each other and to bring in different elements. There are leaders in Afghanistan uh, that are responsible leaders that ought to be part of a coalition government, and hopefully the Taliban leadership will be more open-minded now than it was 20 years ago. I was there at the formation of Taliban. I remember very well these were simple country people, and they were very brave, but they were not very good at political compromise.
um, so one of the things that one of the basics um, of a nation to grow up is education, and proper education needs infrastructure, and that needs a government, and that needs money. And in the past 2 decades, 3 decades, they haven't had none of that, and I don't think in a foreseeable future they're gonna get it. So, where do you think they can? You know, I can see that because when this was happening in Afghanistan, I could hear it from my own circle of friends that blamed Afghans for many of the things that are happening to themselves. But I cannot blame them mostly because in order for them to grow up, they need to educate, and then they cannot educate. They never had the chance to. Do you agree with me? Do you disagree with me? What do you think?
Oh, I agree with you. I believe that the primary and the most important single educational force are mothers. They really teach. And I remember how my mother used to teach me and take me out, walk me around, and talk about architecture and history and things like that. So, by the way, my mother was the first of six children to go to school in Albania. So I've seen that development from really backwardsness to into the modern age. Um, but the problem in Afghanistan was that, first of all, the Pashtun people were not familiar with education, put it that way. And more importantly, the Afghan Communist Party managed to infiltrate the Afghan government through the educational process. And the teachers' unions were communists by and large part, and they used the need for education to assert their power in Afghanistan. That's why the traditional Afghan Maliks were so anti girls' education because they saw them as a communist. That was 20 years ago. I think it's changed now, and there's a more evolved understanding in Afghanistan that they need education quickly.
Um, So, how do you think the situation with Daesh, the ISIS, will evolve?
I don't understand ISIS. It is a terrible curse on the Muslim world. These people are not. I've been with every kind of Muslim revolutionary that there is. I used to be friends with George Habash in Palestine, and you name the groups, I knew them. But Habash, Daesh rather, Daesh, I don't understand. I keep asking myself, who's behind Daesh? Where do they get their money? Where do they get the ammunition that they're shooting off? And why did the Iraqi army just leave all of its equipment, like the Americans did afterwards in Afghanistan? Um, are the Israelis involved with Daesh? I believe they are. I got kicked off a TV station for daring to say that.
So how so? Could you elaborate on that?
Well, we've had reports from the Israeli press that Israeli medical units and hospitals are treating wounded Daesh soldiers. Why? Uh, so that makes me the Daesh has been very helpful for the Israelis. It is what the Turks used to call bashi bazooks, which means these people who come in burn and loot and pillage. Uh, they've been a destructive force. They were used by some Western powers to try and overthrow the government of Syria. They evolved and mutated into complete anarchists. I don't know who's in control of them, if anybody. I think they're just running around doing violence. But it is not an Islamic force. It's not a cohesive force. There's nothing positive to say about these people.
Mhm. Um, will you allow me to ask you a question about Palestine-Israel issue?
Of course.
Oh, I lost you, I guess. Okay. So since you mentioned Israel, so um, what is the what is the solution to this decades of tension, whatever you may call it, crisis, occupation, oppression, whatever the term is, between Israel and Palestine? What is the future for them?
Well, in the Israeli view, the future is that all the Arabs will be driven out eventually into the desert or into Jordan, which they call the real Palestinian state. Uh, that Jewish settlers will come and occupy all of their land, and there will be no more Palestinian problem. As Stalin used to say, "No man, no problem." And I fear that what's going to happen. Anyone who supports the Palestinians is attacked, and very gravely. Look at Turkey. Look at the attempt to overthrow the Turkish government for giving even mild support to the Palestinians. Um, and I think that the Israelis are winning now. They're taking over some of the Arab non-democratic states with a very close influence, like in the Gulf and Saudi Arabia. So everything is on Israel's side. Even Trump said yesterday that he said a few years ago Israel used to own the U.S. Congress, and well, it's still true today. The Israelis have enormous influence and over the United States, and that is not going to change anytime soon. So I see nothing but negative down the road, and I think even the hope of a Palestinian state, which would have been an excellent idea, may not be realized.
Wow. Mr. Margolis, that was wonderful having you with us. I need you to end the show for us, and please, give us your ending comments. Anything that I have missed asking you, anything you want to share with us, please go ahead.
Well, just my point as an old revolutionary that the Muslim world needs a lot more revolution. And I don't include Iran in this. Iran has been the standard bearer for development in the Muslim world, modern thinking. Um, but the Muslim world has so far to go. It's so sad. And the suffering of its people continues without relent. And we in the West are responsible for a lot of that. I hope this changes.